Few people realize how difficult and hopeless the life of a person in prison is. The days are identical and seem to drag on endlessly, so everyone tries to find at least a little joy in the little things. But truth be told, most of the people who end up in prison deserve their punishment. This wasn't Marcos Alonso's first conviction. Although some could argue that his first sentence back in his youth shouldn't be taken into account. Nevertheless, he did have a criminal record, even though he got sentenced to community service. Sure, it wasn't time in prison, but he was still considered a repeat offender. The man didn't make friends with anyone, kept to himself, never asked anyone for anything, and never got any packages or letters. Of course, everyone knew perfectly well what he was in for, and some other inmates even felt somewhat sorry for him. But Marcos didn't need or want their sympathy. When the man had about 1/3 of his sentence left to serve, new inmates arrived at the prison. One of them was a rather nondescript young man. He was pale as milk and had some kind of colorless, cloudy eyes, which seemed to be either half open or half closed all the time. Combined with his lost look and half-open mouth with large front teeth, the young man looked pitiful. Nevertheless, the crime he was convicted of was very serious, and with aggravating circumstances too. Whenever someone learned of what had landed him in prison, they couldn't shake off their shock for at least half a day, trying to comprehend how that was even possible. The young man's name was Carlos, and it was a bit unclear how it happened, but he quickly ended up under the protection of the old inmate, Marcos. There was even a rumor going around the prison that Carlos was Marcos's illegitimate son or some other kind of relative, but they weren't true. Marcos and Carlos were complete strangers who first met in prison. Despite the strict prison rules and regulations, the prisoners got to work in timber processing. In groups of several people escorted by guards, the inmates were taken to the forest and cut down old trees. Sometimes they had to use the truck, but that was only allowed for the inmates who'd served at least half of their sentence, so they wouldn't use that opportunity to run away. Marcos Alonso ended up among those who were allowed to use the truck, and for some unknown reason, and very unexpectedly, Carlos soon joined their group, despite the fact that he'd just started serving his sentence. The old man helped Carlos with everything and seemed to always be around to support and protect him. One day, the two men returned from the logging site in an exceptionally cheerful mood and immediately went into their cell. Ever since then, the two of them started looking even stranger than before. It turned out that they found a lone wolf pup freezing in the middle of the forest that day. At first, Marcos hid him in the nightstand. Then Carlos kept him under his bed. Meanwhile, the pup seemed to understand that he needed to behave quietly and hide from everyone else. Keeping pets was strictly forbidden in prison, even though there were cats in the food warehouses, but they were only allowed to live there to protect the supplies from rodents, and the only dogs allowed in prison were the guard dogs, who were brought in and out by the guards. Any attempts to keep tame birds, rats, or mice were forbidden, because people weren't in there for a comfortable life. And there they had an entire wolf pup, whom they had to hide, feed, and take out on walks somehow. There weren't many guards by the cells, and the inmates could walk around the prison terribly freely, during the allowed time, of course. Unfortunately, there were many ill-wishers among other prisoners, as well as informers. The fact that Carlos was hiding a wolf pup under his bed was reported faster than the animal got used to living there. Although the smart creature showed miracles of disguise, hiding in the darkest and farthest corner, the warden decided to take a rather unconventional approach to dealing with the situation and teach the visitors a lesson that no one else should ever dare to break the rules. The next day, after the roll call, the men had to publicly get rid of the animal in front of the entire prison and in any way that they chose. On the night before the wolf's execution, the inmates decided to run away. They quietly got out of their cell, hiding the animal in their clothes, and went over to the fence. The old man hid a stepladder and wire cutters there in advance, so they could get over the fence and cut the barbed wire. After that, they had to cross a few miles of no man's land, and somehow get over the second fence and another row of barbed wire, and then get to the nearest village where they could steal a car. That day, some wolf or human god must have been on their side, because they managed to overcome all the obstacles. The two friends and the wolf pup were already deep in the taiga when they heard the faint sound of the prison siren. The guards noticed that they were missing. At that point, the young man told Marcos that their plans had changed. They were no longer going to the village because that would be the first place the search party would check. Instead, they were going to go around the village and hide in a forester's hut a few miles away from the settlement. Even though Carlos refused to tell how he knew about that hut, Marcos still agreed to follow him there. When the fugitives arrived at their destination, Marcos realized that his friend was right. Hidden from the prying eyes by a dense spruce forest, the hut was the perfect place to wait out until things calmed down a bit. The hut turned out to be so old and abandoned that it seemed that no one had been there for many decades. The floor was rotten, the roof was cracked, and there was no food whatsoever. But they didn't really have another option. They had to stay. There, the little wolf pup seemed to have understood the complexity of their situation. So he didn't whine or get nervous, but behaved very quietly and calmly. He sat down in the corner and looked around with his beady eyes. Having eaten some of the food they managed to get in prison, the fugitives started getting settled in the new place. A search party had probably been sent for them already, so they had to behave as quietly as possible. Thus, a year had passed. No one ever came to the forest hut, since no one thought of looking for the fugitives in the swampy land so close to the prison. The search for them was probably conducted throughout the county and APBs must have been sent out, but apparently, the incident was soon forgotten. Thus, Carlos was right when he changed the escape plan, thereby saving his partner and himself. The wolf pup grew up big and strong, and most importantly, absolutely healthy. He was very loyal and grateful to his saviors, who had saved him from death twice. The first time in the forest when they found him, warmed him up and fed him, and the second time when they escaped prison. Instead of following the warden's orders and killing him, obeying his instincts, the wolf went out hunting, but he didn't have a wolf pack, only Marcos and Carlos, so he shared his prey with them. The men, in turn, went out on their own hunts into the neighboring village, trying to stay unnoticed by the locals. Sometimes they'd steal a chicken from someone's yard, or some vegetables from the barn. They didn't take much, but they got enough to live on. One day, the wolf, which the fugitives never chose a name for, didn't come back from his hunt. He probably found other wolves and just joined their pack, Carlos suggested. We didn't mean anything to him, but all our problems are because of him. If it weren't for this traitor, I would be almost done with my time now, but now I'll have to be on the run for the rest of my life. The young man, on the other hand, was actually grateful to the wolf for pushing him to escape, but without his prey, they wouldn't be able to survive in the hut. The fugitives decided to get out of the forest and settle down in one of the village houses, hoping to find a lonely, compassionate woman who'd agree to shelter the fugitives without telling other villagers. Having arrived at the village, where they often came to steal food before, the two friends started to watch closely the last house by the forest. It seemed that a lonely woman about Marcos's age lived there. They decided to try their luck with her, aiming to make the woman feel sorry for them. They covered each other in mud and tore their already worn-out clothes. Looking at the two unfortunate men who introduced themselves as father and son, the woman took pity on them and invited them into the house. Sarah, that was the name of the woman, was a widow, but she lived with her 12-year-old daughter. She gave the fugitives some clothes that belonged to her late husband and seemed to have taken a liking to Marcos. The guests were behaving very decently at first. They helped Sarah a lot with the housework and were kind to her daughter Bella, so they quickly won the woman's trust. One day, when the woman went into the city on business, she left her daughter with the two men. Sarah didn't even think that anything bad could happen. They seemed so nice that she couldn't even believe that they were runaway prisoners. That evening, the fugitives found some alcohol in the woman's cellar and helped themselves to it. As they both got drunk, they came up with a cruel idea to get some money from the owner of the house. Since they were alone with her daughter, they decided to abduct her and ask Sarah for ransom, hoping that the woman had a stash of valuables hidden somewhere around the house. They asked the girl to go to the barn with them, and the trusting child couldn't even suspect that something could be wrong, since the men had been so kind to her, helping her with her homework and fixing her bike. As the naive girl stepped into the barn, the fugitives rushed at her. They didn't even have time to tie her hands as the girl started screaming, and a huge wolf jumped out from a corner. It took the wolf less than a second to make the obvious decision in favor of protecting the child. What he did next was terrifying. By an interesting twist of fate, the child's savior turned out to be the same wolf that the fugitives had once saved and escaped prison for. He didn't run away to join a wolf pack, but simply fell into a trap. Sarah found him there and took pity on the animal. She freed him and brought him home, settling him in the barn, which the family didn't use often. The girl became friends with the animal, and then he saved her. It wasn't hard to guess how the predator used his fangs to protect his little friend from the fugitives. When they got to court, the two men couldn't even sit down. There were so many lacerations on them.